The howl of a relentless wind masked Abigail Winters' footsteps as she crept through Redstone's dusty back alleys in the pitch darkness of 1876, clutching a weathered leather satchel containing everything she owned in this world. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as she glanced over her shoulder, certain she would see the looming shadow of her stepfather following behind. 3 years of enduring his tyranny since her mother's passing had finally broken her resolve to stay. At 21, she had nothing left in this mining town but painful memories and broken promises. The distant glow of lanterns from the saloon cast eerie shadows as Abigail hurried toward the stables on the outskirts of town. She had planned this escape for months, saving every penny from her seamstress work, waiting for the perfect night when most of the town would be distracted by the monthly poker tournament at the Silver Spade. Redstone had once been her sanctuary, a place where she and her mother had built a modest but happy life after fleeing the devastation of their farm during the war. Now it felt like a prison, with walls closing in each time her stepfather, Vernon Hall, town banker and respected businessman, returned home drunk and belligerent, making demands no stepdaughter should ever have to endure. As she approached the stables, Abigail froze. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. "Going somewhere, Miss Winters?" The voice was low, with a slight southern drawl that she recognized immediately. "Mr. Reynolds," she whispered, clutching her satchel tighter. "Please, I cannot stay in Redstone any longer." Matthew Reynolds stepped into a patch of moonlight, his face partially hidden beneath the wide brim of his Stetson. At 26, he had established himself as one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, despite his youth. His cattle operation outside town employed half a dozen men, and his reputation for fair dealings was matched only by his skill with horses, and a revolver, both of which had served him well in the untamed Montana territory. "I figured as much when I saw you sneaking past the mercantile with that bag," he said, his eyes darting toward the town. "Vernon's looking for you, already got 3 men searching the north end." Abigail's blood turned to ice. "Then I must leave now." "Please, Mr. Reynolds, I beg you not to alert him." Matthew studied her face, noting the fading bruise near her temple that her bonnet couldn't quite conceal. His jaw tightened. He'd suspected Vernon's true nature for months, watching how Abigail flinched whenever the banker raised his voice, how she'd begun to shrink into herself around town. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Helena first, then perhaps California." "My mother's cousin lives in San Francisco." Matthew nodded slowly, seeming to consider something. He disappeared into the stable, returning moments later leading 2 saddled horses, his chestnut gelding and a dappled gray mare. "The gray is Willow." "She's gentle but has good endurance," he said, handing Abigail the reins. She stared at him, confused. "Mr. Reynolds, I cannot accept. I'm not giving her to you," he interrupted, securing her satchel to the saddle. "I'm coming with you." "That's absurd." "You have your ranch, your men, foremen can handle things. Been meaning to check on some business in Helena anyway." His tone suggested the matter was settled, though they both knew it for the lie it was. "I cannot allow you to endanger yourself on my account," Abigail insisted, even as relief flooded through her veins at the prospect of not facing the wilderness alone. Matthew's expression hardened as he swung himself into his saddle with practiced ease. "Miss Winters, I've watched that man parade around town like some kind of gentleman while treating you worse than a man would treat a starving dog. I won't stand for it anymore." Before she could argue further, shouts echoed from the direction of town. Vernon's search party was getting closer. "Now or never, Miss Winters," Matthew said, extending his hand. With a deep breath, Abigail took his hand and mounted the mare, adjusting her skirts as best she could for riding astride. They set off at a trot, keeping to the shadows until they reached the edge of town. As Redstone fell away behind them, Matthew led them north before cutting east, away from the main road where they might be followed. Under a vast canopy of stars, They rode side by side, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats the only conversation for miles. Abigail's mind raced with the enormity of what she'd done. There was no going back now. Vernon would never forgive such defiance. His pride alone would demand retribution. When they finally stopped to rest the horses near a small creek, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. Abigail slid from her saddle, her legs trembling from hours of riding. "We should reach Thompson's Crossing by nightfall," Matthew said as he helped her down, his hands firm but gentle on her waist. "There's a widow there who keeps a few rooms. We can rest properly before continuing to Helena." Abigail nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and gratitude. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the burbling creek. Matthew busied himself with watering the horses. "Some things a man just can't abide," he said finally. "What Vernon's been doing to you is one of them. You've risked everything. Your ranch is just land and cattle," he finished for her. "Important, yes, but not worth looking the other way while." He trailed off, unable to say aloud what they both knew. As they continued their journey through the rugged Montana wilderness, Abigail found herself studying Matthew when he wasn't looking. She'd known him for nearly 2 years, but realized how little she truly knew about him. He was respected in Redstone, but largely kept to himself, attending church on Sundays and occasionally joining the men at the saloon, though he never stayed long or drank to excess. "Have you always lived in Montana territory?" she asked as they rode side by side through a pine forest, the morning sun filtering through the branches. Matthew adjusted his hat, squinting at the horizon. "No, madam, came up from Texas after the war. Worked cattle drives for a few years before winning that plot of land in a poker game from a man too drunk to know what he was wagering. I'd heard it was a card game, but I assumed that was just town gossip." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Folks do love their stories. Truth is, I won fair and square, but felt bad about it after. Hired the man as my first ranch hand for 3 years until he saved enough to buy his own spread up in Canada." This revelation surprised her. It wasn't the action of a man interested only in his own fortune. And before Texas. She pressed, curious now, "Virginia. My family had a small farm, lost it and most of my family during the war." His voice had grown quieter and Abigail regretted her question. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Matthew shook his head. "Long time ago now. Built something new, just like you're fixing to do." By midday, they stopped in a sheltered meadow to rest and eat some of the provisions. Matthew had packed jerky, hard biscuits, and dried apples. As they sat on a fallen log, Abigail felt the weight of her exhaustion settling into her bones. "We can rest longer if you need," Matthew offered, noticing her fatigue. "No," she insisted. "The further we get from Redstone, the better I'll feel." Matthew nodded, understanding. "Vernon won't give up easily. Man like that, his pride won't allow it." "It's not just pride," Abigail said, staring at her hands. "He owes debts, gambling debts. My mother left me a small inheritance from the sale of our farm in Kentucky. He's been trying to get me to sign it over for months." Matthew's expression darkened. "That explains his sudden interest in marriage. A husband would have legal claim to your inheritance." "Yes. After Mother died, he changed, started drinking more, staying out at the tables. When he lost, he'd come home." She trailed off, unable to continue. "You don't need to explain," Matthew said gently. "But I'm glad you told me. Helps me understand what we're up against." The "we" didn't escape Abigail's notice, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt something other than fear and loneliness. She felt protected. As they continued their journey, the terrain grew more challenging, forcing them to navigate steep ridges and dense thickets. Matthew proved to be an adept guide, finding paths Abigail would never have noticed and watching constantly for signs of pursuit or danger. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and a distant rumble of thunder warned of an approaching storm. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles east," Matthew said, scanning the darkening sky. used by cowboys during spring roundups. It's not much, but it's better than being caught in the open when that storm hits. They reached the weathered cabin just as the first heavy drops began to fall. It was indeed small, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank floors, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. Matthew quickly tended to the horses in the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin while Abigail assessed their shelter. The roof appeared sound, though a few dribbles of water found their way through in one corner. A stack of firewood beside the hearth was dry enough to burn, and Abigail set about starting a fire while Matthew brought in their saddlebags. As the storm intensified outside, howling around the cabin's corners and lashing rain against the single grimy window, Abigail found herself grateful for the solid walls between them and the elements. Matthew hung their damp outer clothes near the fire and laid out the last of their provisions on a rough-hewn table. "Not exactly the dining room at the Redstone Hotel," he said with a wry smile, "but it'll keep us going." Abigail felt a sudden urge to laugh, the first genuine lightness she'd felt in months. "Mr. Reynolds, after 3 years of Vernon's company at meals, this is a feast fit for royalty." Their eyes met across the small fire-lit space, and something shifted between them. No longer merely escapees on the run, they were now two people sharing a meal and shelter against the storm. "Matthew," he said quietly, "if we're going to be traveling companions, I think you should call me Matthew." "Then you must call me Abigail," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. As they ate their simple meal, Matthew shared stories of cattle drives and the characters he'd met along the way. Abigail found herself laughing at his descriptions of ornery trail cooks and greenhorn cowboys facing their first stampede. "And what about before the war?" Abigail asked, curious about the life he'd led before losing everything. "What was your family like?" Matthew's expression grew distant but not pained as it had earlier. "Good people, simple farmers. My father believed in working hard and treating folks fairly. Mother was gentle but strong, had to be with 5 boys in the house. 5 boys, no wonder you learned to fend for yourself." A genuine smile crossed his face. "I was the middle one, always trying to keep up with my older brothers and look out for the younger ones." His smile faded slightly. "Lost my oldest brother at Gettysburg and the next at Cold Harbor. Youngest died of fever during the last winter of the war." "And the other brother?" Abigail asked softly. "Robert's in Oregon now, has a logging operation. We write a few times a year." He hesitated, then added, "Family's important. That's why I understand you wanting to reach your mother's cousin." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white light before plunging it back into the warm glow of the fire. The thunder that followed rattled the window, and Abigail jumped despite herself. "Never liked storms," she admitted. "Even as a child." "They pass," Matthew said simply. "Just like most troubles, if you wait them out." As the evening wore on, the storm showed no signs of abating. Matthew insisted Abigail take the cot while he made a bedroll from blankets near the fire. Despite her protests about his chivalry, she was grateful for the relative comfort after a long day in the saddle. Lying in the darkness, listening to the rain and occasional rumble of thunder, Abigail found herself thinking about the man sleeping just a few feet away. In Redstone, Matthew Reynolds had been a distant figure, respected but somewhat mysterious. Now, in the span of less than a day, he had become her protector, guide, and perhaps something close to a friend. She wondered what awaited them in Helena and beyond. Would Vernon pursue them? Would Matthew truly accompany her all the way to San Francisco, or would he turn back once she was safely away from Montana territory? The thought of continuing alone filled her with an unexpected sadness. Morning arrived with watery sunshine and the drip of rainwater from the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Abigail woke to find Matthew already outside, tending to the horses. When he returned, his hair was damp from the wet branches, but his expression was alert and focused. "Trail's muddy but passable," he reported. If we start soon, we can make Thompson's Crossing by nightfall just as planned. Thompson's Crossing turned out to be little more than a cluster of buildings serving travelers along the Helena Road, a general store, a smithy, and the widow's boarding house Matthew had mentioned. Mrs. Thompson herself was a stout woman in her 50s with keen eyes that missed nothing. 2 rooms, she said firmly when they approached her counter, giving them a pointed look that suggested she wasn't fooled by whatever story they might offer. Breakfast at 6, extra for hot water. If she recognized them or had heard news from Redstone, she gave no indication. Matthew paid for their rooms and a hot bath for Abigail, who nearly wept at the prospect of clean water and privacy after their journey. Later, refreshed and wearing the cleanest dress from her satchel, Abigail met Matthew in the small dining room. The other guests, a traveling salesman and an elderly couple, paid them little attention as Mrs. Thompson served a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread. "I telegraphed my foreman from the general store," Matthew said quietly as they ate. "Asked him to keep an eye on Vernon's movements and send word to Helena if necessary." Abigail paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "You think he'll come after us?" "I think it's best to be prepared," Matthew replied carefully. "Vernon has connections in the territory. If he's serious about getting your inheritance, he won't give up easily." The reminder of the danger they still faced dampened Abigail's spirits, which had lifted considerably after the hot bath and meal. She pushed her bowl away, suddenly less hungry. "We should reach Helena in 2 more days," Matthew continued, his voice low. "From there, you'll have choices. Stage to Bozeman, then the Utah and Northern Railway south or west to Missoula and on to Washington Territory." "And you?" Abigail asked, finally voicing the question that had been troubling her. "Will you return to your ranch once we reach Helena?" Matthew considered his response carefully. "That depends," he said at last. "On what? On whether Vernon's still a threat, on whether you still need." He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Protection," he finished, though something in his expression suggested he'd been thinking of a different word entirely. That night, alone in her small room at the boarding house, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. The bed was comfortable enough, certainly more so than the cot in the lined shack, but her mind refused to quiet. She kept replaying Matthew's words and the way his eyes had held hers across the dinner table. She'd never allowed herself to think of Matthew Reynolds as anything other than a respected figure in town, a successful rancher who occasionally nodded politely to her after Sunday services, or when they passed on Redstone's Main Street. To contemplate any other sort of relationship would have been foolish, given her circumstances and Vernon's controlling presence. But now, away from Redstone and Vernon's shadow, she found herself wondering. The way Matthew had come to her aid without hesitation, risking his business and reputation, spoke of something deeper than mere neighborly concern. The next morning brought clear skies and warmer temperatures as they continued their journey toward Helena. The road was busier now, with freight wagons and other travelers passing regularly. Matthew remained vigilant, studying each approaching rider or vehicle with careful attention. "Have you ever been to San Francisco?" Abigail asked as they rode side by side, the mountains rising majestically around them. Matthew shook his head. "Never made it further west than Virginia City in Nevada Territory. Heard it's quite a place, though. Ships from all over the world, buildings taller than you can imagine, people from every corner of the earth. Mother's cousin writes that there are proper theaters and libraries, restaurants serving food from China and Italy." Abigail's voice took on a dreamy quality. "After years in Redstone, it sounds like a different world." "It is," Matthew agreed. "Question is it the world you want?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just knew I had to get away from Vernon, and after." "Once you're safe from him," Abigail considered this. In her desperation to escape, she had thought little beyond reaching her mother's cousin. "I suppose I'd find work. I'm a skilled seamstress." Mother's cousin mentioned there might be positions in the better shops there. Matthew nodded but said nothing more, his eyes scanning the horizon ahead. As they made camp that evening, selecting a sheltered spot near a small stream, Abigail found herself studying Matthew with new awareness. The easy way he moved, efficient and purposeful. The gentleness in his hands as he tended the horses, the quiet strength in his features as he built their fire. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After Helena, if Vernon no longer poses a threat?" Matthew looked up from the fire, his face partially shadowed in the fading light. "Return to the ranch, I suppose. Spring calving will be starting soon." "You love it there," Abigail observed. "It wasn't a question. Took a while to feel like home," he admitted. "But yes, I do. Built something good there." "Then I've taken you away from it," she said, guilt coloring her voice. "I never meant to." "You didn't take me anywhere, Abigail," he interrupted gently. "I made my choice, same as you did when you decided to leave Redstone." Their gazes held across the fire, and Abigail felt a flutter of something unfamiliar but not unwelcome in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly see Matthew Reynolds not as her rescuer or protector, but as a man, one who had sacrificed for her without hesitation, who had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for coming with me, but for seeing what was happening when no one else would." A muscle twitched in Matthew's jaw. Plenty saw, they just chose to look away. Vernon's position in town made him untouchable, Abigail finished for him. "I know. After Mother died, I learned quickly who my true friends were." She paused, twisting her hands in her lap. "There weren't many. People fear what challenging men like Vernon might cost them," Matthew said. "Loans called in, businesses struggling suddenly. Man has a long reach when he controls the money." "And yet you weren't afraid," Abigail pointed out. Matthew's expression hardened slightly. "I've seen what men like Vernon can do. After the war, men with power and no conscience nearly destroyed what was left of my home county. I swore then I'd never stand by again." The depth of feeling in his voice surprised her, revealing layers to Matthew she hadn't glimpsed before. Not just a successful rancher with a strong moral compass, but a man shaped by loss and injustice, determined to stand against it wherever he found it. As they prepared their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Abigail felt a strange mixture of emotions. Gratitude for Matthew's presence and protection, anxiety about what awaited them in Helena and beyond, and something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire between them. The following day brought them within sight of Helena, its buildings sprawling across the valley below them as they crested a final ridge. The territorial capital was far larger than Redstone, with proper streets, substantial buildings, and the constant movement of commerce and people. "We'll find a hotel," Matthew said as they approached the outskirts of town. "Something respectable but not too prominent. I'll check if there are any messages from my foreman." The Grand Western Hotel was neither the largest nor the most elegant establishment in Helena, but its 3 stories of red brick with white trim looked clean and well maintained. After securing rooms and stabling the horses, Matthew left to visit the telegraph office while Abigail rested in the hotel's small sitting room. When Matthew returned an hour later, his expression was grim. He sat beside Abigail on a small settee, speaking in a low voice to avoid being overheard by the elderly couple reading newspapers across the room. "Vernon left Redstone the morning after we did. With 3 men, his assistant from the bank, and 2 others my foreman didn't recognize." Abigail's hands began to tremble. "He's coming after us." "He was," Matthew corrected. "They were seen heading this way, but no one knows if they actually reached Helena. There's been no sign of them in town, according to my contacts." "Contacts? I do business here occasionally. Have some friends in the stockyards and shipping offices." He hesitated before adding, "I've arranged for you to stay with a family. I trust the Andersons. Samuel Anderson runs the largest dry goods store in town. His wife Sarah is a kind woman who'll welcome you until we determine our next move." Abigail frowned. "Why can't I remain here at the hotel? Too exposed. Vernon knows we were headed to Helena. If he arrives, the hotels will be the first place he checks." Matthew's expression softened at her clear dismay. "The Andersons have a lovely home. You'll be comfortable there and safe." "And where will you be?" Abigail asked, suddenly fearful of being separated from the one person who had stood by her. "Close by," Matthew assured her, "but not so close that Vernon connects you to me if he's asking questions around town." Though she understood the logic, Abigail felt a sense of loss at the prospect of not having Matthew nearby. In just a few days, his presence had become a comfort she hadn't realized she'd come to depend on. That evening, after being warmly welcomed by the Anderson family, Abigail found herself alone in a comfortable guest bedroom, staring out the window at the lamplit streets of Helena. The Andersons lived in a prosperous neighborhood not far from the business district, their large home a testament to the success of Mr. Anderson's store. Mrs. Anderson had been kindness itself, providing Abigail with a hot meal and fresh nightclothes, asking no questions beyond those necessary to make her comfortable. Their 2 children, a boy of about 12 and a girl of perhaps 15, had been equally welcoming, if somewhat curious about their unexpected guest. As promised, Matthew had remained close by, taking a room at a boarding house just 2 streets over. He'd walked with Abigail and Mrs. Anderson to the house, carrying Abigail's satchel and speaking quietly with Mr. Anderson before taking his leave with a promise to return in the morning. Alone now, Abigail found her thoughts returning to Vernon and the danger he still posed. What would happen when he inevitably reached Helena? Would the presence of the Andersons and Matthew be enough to deter him? And what of her plans to continue to San Francisco? The questions swirled in her mind until exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of pursuit and narrow escapes. Morning brought sunshine streaming through lace curtains, and the smell of coffee and baking bread wafting up from the Anderson kitchen. Abigail dressed in her best remaining dress, a blue calico with minimal wrinkles from her travels, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Anderson greeted her warmly, insisting she eat a proper breakfast. "Mr. Reynolds said he would call for you at 9, she informed Abigail as she poured coffee. "He mentioned something about visiting the bank," Abigail nodded, surprised Matthew had already been by the house. "Yes, I need to inquire about transferring my inheritance. It's currently held in trust at the Redstone Bank." Mrs. Anderson's expression grew serious. "Mr. Reynolds explained some of your circumstances to Samuel last night. Not all the details, of course, but enough that we understand the importance of discretion." She patted Abigail's hand reassuringly. "You're safe here, my dear. Samuel has considerable influence in Helena, and we have many friends." Touched by the woman's kindness, Abigail felt tears threatening. "Thank you. You've been so generous to a complete stranger." "Any friend of Matthew Reynolds is welcome in our home," Mrs. Anderson replied firmly. "He saved Samuel's life 3 years ago when their stagecoach was attacked by road agents outside Virginia City. Samuel was wounded, and Matthew got him to a doctor despite the danger." She smiled fondly. "That man's loyalty is beyond question." This revelation added yet another dimension to Abigail's growing understanding of Matthew. He had never mentioned this incident during their journey, despite ample opportunity to do so. When Matthew arrived promptly at 9, Abigail was struck by his transformed appearance. Gone were the trail-worn clothes and dusty boots. In their place, he wore a well-cut dark suit, polished boots, and a crisp white shirt. His normally unruly hair had been neatly combed, and he'd clearly visited a barber, his jawline now clean-shaven. "You look." Abigail began, then faltered, suddenly aware of Mrs. Anderson's interested gaze. "Respectable enough for banking business," Matthew supplied with a slight smile. "Thought it might help our cause if I didn't look like I'd just come off the range." The Montana Territorial Bank was an imposing stone structure in the heart of Helena's business district. Inside, The marble floors and mahogany counters spoke of solidity and wealth, a sharp contrast to the modest redstone bank where Vernon had presided. Matthew escorted Abigail to a private office where they were received by Mr. Hargrove, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and spectacles. After examining the paperwork, Abigail had brought her mother's will and trust documents. He nodded thoughtfully. "Everything appears in order, Miss Winters. However, as your stepfather is the executor of the trust until your 25th birthday or marriage, we would typically require his signature to release these funds." Abigail's heart sank. "But the trust is in my name. The money is mine." "Indeed, but the legal control remains with the executor until the conditions are met." Mr. Hargrove's expression was sympathetic but firm. Matthew leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hargrove, Miss Winters has reason to believe that her stepfather intends to misappropriate these funds. There have been," he glanced at Abigail, "circumstances that have forced her to leave Redstone for her own safety." Mr. Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see, that is indeed concerning." He removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "There may be a legal solution. If you were to petition the territorial court with evidence of misconduct, they might appoint a different executor." "How long would such a process take?" Matthew asked. "Weeks, possibly months." Mr. Hargrove replaced his spectacles. "However, there is another option, though I hesitate to suggest it." "Please," Abigail urged. "I need to secure my inheritance before Vernon reaches Helena." "Marriage," Mr. Hargrove said simply. "According to these documents, your trust passes fully to your control upon marriage, with your husband assuming the executor role from Mr. Hall." A heavy silence filled the office. Abigail felt her cheeks grow warm as she deliberately avoided looking at Matthew. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hargrove," Matthew said finally. "We'll consider the options you've presented." Outside the bank, Abigail walked beside Matthew in stunned silence, processing what they'd learned. The busy streets of Helena flowed around them: merchants, miners, ladies shopping, children darting between adults, but Abigail barely noticed any of it. "There must be another way," she said finally, as they paused at a quiet corner away from the main thoroughfare. Matthew's expression was unreadable. "The court petition is an option, though it would mean staying in Helena indefinitely. And if Vernon arrives before the petition is heard, then we'd face him here with the Andersons' support and the protection of the law." Matthew's tone was confident, but Abigail could see the concern in his eyes. "Or I could continue to San Francisco immediately," Abigail suggested. "Leave the inheritance behind." "Is that what you want?" Matthew asked carefully. "To abandon what's rightfully yours?" Abigail sighed, frustrated by the impossible situation. "Of course not. That money represents everything my mother worked for after my father died. But I don't see how." She stopped abruptly as Matthew took her hand, his expression suddenly intense. "Marry me," he said, the words simple but weighted with meaning. Abigail stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What, marry me?" he repeated. "Today, if possible. It solves the immediate problem with the trust, and it gives you protection under the law that Vernon can't overcome." "Matthew, you can't be serious. Marriage is a partnership," he finished for her. "Between two people who respect each other. We've already proven we can face difficulties together." His voice softened. "I'm not proposing out of mere convenience, Abigail. These past days with you have shown me something I didn't expect to find when I followed you out of Redstone." Abigail felt her heart beating wildly in her chest. "And what is that?" "A woman of extraordinary courage and grace. Someone I admire more with each passing hour." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I'm not claiming to be in love. We've known each other too briefly for such declarations. But I believe we could build something true together, given time." The sincerity in his eyes took Abigail's breath away. This was no calculating offer made solely to secure her inheritance. Matthew Reynolds was offering her his name, his protection, and the promise of something that might grow into love. "What of your ranch?" she asked. "Your life in Redstone?" The ranch will remain whether I return in a week or a month or a year. His gaze never wavered from hers. As for Redstone, it holds nothing for me that compares to what I've found with you on this journey. Abigail felt tears threatening. No man had ever spoken to her with such honesty and respect. Vernon had seen her only as a means to her inheritance. Other suitors before him had been interested in her pretty face or her modest dowry. None had seen her as Matthew did a woman of worth beyond these things. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I will marry you, Matthew Reynolds." The simple ceremony took place that afternoon in the parlor of the Anderson home, with Mr. and Mrs. Anderson serving as witnesses. The minister, a friend of the family, asked few questions beyond ensuring both parties were entering the marriage willingly. Abigail wore her blue calico dress with wildflowers hastily gathered by the Anderson children, while Matthew appeared in his suit, his expression solemn but his eyes alight with something that made Abigail's heart flutter. By sunset, they were legally married, and a telegram had been sent to the Redstone Bank informing them of the change in Abigail's status and requesting the transfer of her trust to the Montana Territorial Bank in Helena. That evening, as they sat together in the small private parlor the Andersons had graciously provided for the newlyweds, Abigail found herself studying the simple gold band on her finger, a ring Matthew had somehow managed to purchase during the few hours between her acceptance and the ceremony. "It's beautiful," she said softly, turning the band in the lamplight. "It's simple," Matthew replied, watching her from his chair beside the fire. "When we return to the ranch, you can choose something more elaborate if you wish." "Return to the ranch?" Abigail looked up, surprised. "I thought perhaps we would continue to San Francisco as planned." Matthew moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "We can if that's what you truly want, but I hoped you might consider making a home with me in Montana." He took her hand gently. "Not in Redstone, necessarily. We could build a new house further from town, closer to the good grazing land to the north." The thought of returning to Montana Territory, of building a life with Matthew away from Vernon's influence, filled Abigail with unexpected warmth. She had been so focused on escape, on reaching the distant safety of San Francisco, that she hadn't considered the possibility of finding happiness closer to where her journey had begun. "I would like that," she said honestly, "to build something new with you." Relief and joy spread across Matthew's features. "We'll face Vernon together, secure your inheritance, and make our own beginning." He hesitated, then added softly, "I may not have declared love when I proposed, Abigail, but I believe it's already taking root. These few days with you have changed everything for me." Abigail felt a matching emotion unfurling in her own heart, something tender and new, but with the promise of deepening into something lasting. "For me as well," she admitted. "When you appeared at the stables that night, I thought only of escape. I never imagined finding someone who would stand beside me, who would see me as you do." Their first kiss as husband and wife was gentle, a promise rather than a passion, though Abigail felt the potential for that too, simmering beneath the surface of their newfound connection. 3 days later, word came from Matthew's foreman. Vernon had indeed reached Helena, but had departed again after learning from indiscreet questioning at the banks that Abigail Winters was now Abigail Reynolds, with her inheritance secured beyond his reach. The news that his stepdaughter had not only escaped, but had married a respected rancher, had apparently broken what remained of Vernon's reputation in Redstone. He had returned only long enough to collect his belongings before departing for parts unknown, reportedly headed east with considerable gambling debts left unpaid. With the immediate danger past and Abigail's inheritance secure, they began planning their return to Matthew's ranch. Not as fugitives fleeing in the night, but as husband and wife, riding side by side toward a future neither had imagined when Abigail had first attempted to flee Redstone at midnight nearly 2 weeks earlier. Their journey back took them past the line shack where they had sheltered during the storm. By mutual agreement, they stopped there for a night, finding the simple cabin transformed in their memories from a mere refuge to the place where they had first begun to see each other clearly. As they sat before a small fire, much as they had on that stormy night, Matthew took Abigail's hand, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about that night you tried to leave Redstone," he said. "What made you decide to help me that night?" Abigail asked, the question she had wondered about since the beginning. Matthew considered his answer carefully. "I'd been watching Vernon for months, seeing how he treated you, hearing rumors about his gambling debts. When I saw you slipping toward the stables that night, I knew you were finally breaking free." He squeezed her hand gently. "I couldn't let you face the wilderness alone, knowing what and who you were fleeing. So you rode beside me," Abigail said softly. "And I'll never turn back," Matthew promised, sealing his words with a kiss that spoke of all they had found together: safety, respect, partnership, and the deepening love that had grown from the seeds planted during their desperate flight from Redstone. As spring bloomed across the Montana territory, the new house Matthew had promised rose on a gentle hill overlooking the northern pastures of his ranch. Larger and more comfortable than his original cabin, it featured a proper kitchen where Abigail experimented with recipes shared by Mrs. Anderson, a study where Matthew kept the ranch accounts, and a wide porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple. Redstone lay 20 miles to the south, close enough for necessary business, but distant enough that the memories of Vernon's cruelty faded with each passing season. In their place grew new memories of cattle drives and harvest celebrations, of friendships formed with neighboring ranchers and their wives, of quiet nights by the fire planning for the future. And when, a year after their hasty wedding in Helena, Abigail placed Matthew's hand on her growing belly, the joy in his eyes confirmed what she had come to believe during their journey from midnight flight to morning promise: that sometimes the road to happiness begins with the courage to flee what hurts us, and the blessing of finding someone willing to ride beside us, never turning back.